Great. A very good evening and welcome to our Sunday evening seminar. Thank you very much for coming as we think about this important topic of assisted suicide. So hopefully you have a handout and a pen if that is helpful. In a few moments I will tell you a little bit about how the evening is going to work so you can be clear about expectations, but I'm going to begin now with a prayer. Our Father, we thank you very much for this chance to be together. We thank you for your word and its clarity. Thank you for your Spirit and his presence with us. We long to be those who think your thoughts after you. We long to be those who have courage to stand up for what is true and compassion, real compassion towards those who are suffering. As we think about this sensitive and complicated topic, we pray for your help. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. So in March 2007, in a scrum during a game of rugby in Stoke, the 22-year-old Daniel James had a terrible accident. He suffered an injury to his spinal cord that paralysed him from the chest down. At that moment, his long dreamed hopes for playing for England were dashed, his life irreversibly reversed. Over the following months, his parents tried to do all they could to support him, but despite his efforts, he lost the will to live. After a couple of failed suicide attempts, he begged his parents to take him to Switzerland, to the infamous Dignitas clinic, and to end his life via assisted suicide. And so it was that in October 2008, accompanied by his parents, he took the journey to Zurich, to the clinic, and he took a lethal dose of barbiturates and he died. His parents described his death as a release from the prison that his body had become and from the fear and loathing of his lived experience. The media response was to affirm the courage of his parents in supporting him. And no doubt you will have heard of many similar stories to that one. And every time it happens, there's something of an outcry in the media where people say things like, why did they have to go to Switzerland? Why weren't they able to end their life at home with loved ones? Isn't it time we have a change in law? Why is it that we allow animals to be put down, but not humans? And so with this growth in public pressure and approval over recent times, we've come to a place where you'll know in a couple of weeks' time, our politicians will be debating the assisted dying bill. The Labour MP, Kim Ledbetter, has put forward a private member's bill with the proposal that in the case of mentally competent, terminally ill adults, there should be freedom to end their lives. You may know this is not the first time that assisted suicide has been debated in Parliament. In 2015, there was a 330-118 vote against it. And yet we come back to this topic, partly because the mood has changed, the politicians have changed. And although it is a free vote, it is quite possible that this law will come in very shortly into our country. And for some people, this is another milestone in the Grand March of Progress. And yet for others, there is much more fear and caution. And so this evening, thank you for coming to think about this pretty dark and unpleasant topic, the topic of assisted suicide and euthanasia. Now, whatever happens on November the 29th, the reality is that we all need to think carefully about this topic. And if we are Christians here this evening, we need to be asking, well, what does the Bible teach us about it? And if it is right that it is wrong, is there a better way forward? So the plan for this evening is I'm going to give you a minute or two in a minute to discuss your initial thoughts or questions you have about this topic. Then I'm going to spend a chunk of time exploring the issue and giving something of a biblical response. Then we're very, very thankful to have Mark Banting, a friend from Southampton who's a palliative care doctor. He's not come to sing, despite her looks. It's not a duo or a duet. I'm going to be talking to him and asking him about his role in palliative care and finding out about that and how Christians can support a better way forward. Depending on time, we will hopefully have something of a Q&A, and I'm also really keen that we have some time to pray this evening. So that's the plan. Hopefully that's kind of what you expected. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes now. Just turn to people around you in your handout. What are your thoughts on assisted suicide? What questions do you have? Over to you. So let's start by thinking about the case for assisted suicide. Sometimes these terms, euthanasia, assisted suicide, are used interchangeably. Sometimes they're used differently. But to be as clear as we can in relation to terminology, assisted suicide is intentionally helping another person to end their lives. It's not the same thing as letting someone die naturally or withholding fruitless medical treatment. This is positively bringing death into the equation. This is slightly different from euthanasia, which is the act of deliberately ending a person's life to relieve suffering. So in the case of assisted suicide, a doctor may prepare the lethal injection, guide the individual in how to use it. But the key difference is that in assisted suicide, the dying individual is the one who takes the decisive act. And that's what's being argued for in our country. You'll be aware that the language of assisted dying is used, where a terminally ill person is helped to die. And that term is preferred by people because it's more palatable to us, because it avoids using the S word, the word suicide. But of course, assisted dying is a euphemism, just as euthanasia is a euphemism. Euthanasia means good death, because with assisted dying, what we're still talking about, what we're actually talking about is suicide. It's encouraging someone and helping someone to murder themselves, which of course is what suicide is. And it's quite helpful for us to be aware of how the language that is used about this can obscure the issue. So if you hear people who are arguing for the assisted dying bill, we're hearing language used like safety and safeguards and choice and protection and family and shortening death, not ending life. But we mustn't be numbed by the apparent harmlessness of the language. Here's what Kathleen Stock, the philosopher, wrote. At times it sounds as if one is being offered a particularly relaxing spa treatment. With a pleasing ring of supportiveness, you are now being assisted in achieving something rather than being killed by a doctor or killing yourself. So the question is, why do so many people believe that this is a good thing and want to see the law change? Well, there are two main arguments for assisted suicide. First is the argument from compassion. So this argument states very simply that because we should want to alleviate suffering, in the cases where there is great pain for people near the end of their lives, there should be the provision to end them. And if we really care about people and their suffering, that is the compassionate thing to do. In the case of an animal, the kind solution is to end their suffering, so why not a person? Why treat the dog better than you treat the elderly? And so because we want to promote health and relieve suffering, we ought to allow assisted suicide. And of course, this kind of argument has a lot of traction in a society like ours, where we idolize youth and health and productivity and vigor, and where philosophically we see no benefit whatsoever to suffering. The basic goal of the Western life is what you might call utilitarian, the belief that whatever is morally right is what promotes the maximum amount of happiness for the maximum amount of people. And so many people would live by this mantra: avoid pain and pursue pleasure. They may not say that, but that's basically what they would see life as about. And so if someone is in a situation of irreversible suffering, well, what purpose is there to them being alive? It is much kinder to allow them to die. So here's how the former Archbishop, Lord Carey, put it: if we truly love our neighbours as ourselves, how can we deny them the death that we would wish for ourselves in such a condition? Now that is the argument from compassion. The other main argument that is used is the argument from autonomy. Now, in this case, the point is made that what matters most in life is individual freedom. Autonomy means self-rule. And for most people in our society, this really is the driving force behind our ethical convictions. It was the philosopher John Stuart Mill who said over himself, over his mind and body, the individual is sovereign. And that's what we believe in our culture, where other cultures around the world or in the past would value community or tradition. This is the thing we value. We value freedom. We live in what has been called the I world, the age of the individual. And we say as long as what we want doesn't harm anyone else, well, what's the problem? I should be free to do what I want, when I want, and how I want. And no one has the right to get in my way. That is the basis on which we as a culture argue for abortion and gay marriage and no-fault divorce and gender self-identification. Autonomy. And so if I can choose how I live my life, well, I ought to be able to choose how I end my life. It's dehumanizing, people would say. For me, as an adult who's lived an independent life, to end my life without freedom, to end my life being a burden on other people, returning to a childlike existence of dependence, where other people feed me, wash me, and clothe me. There's nothing more humiliating. And so we have the suggestion that people would rather die, the right to die. It's the argument from autonomy. Here's how the writer Terry Pratchett put it, I believe, that any individual should have the right to choose, as far as it is possible, the time and the conditions of their death. I think it's time we learn to be as good at dying as we are at living. Now, it's interesting that where assisted suicide has been legalized, different countries have leaned more on one of these arguments than the other. But for many people, taken together, we have their two knockdown arguments in favor of a change in law. The argument from compassion and the argument from autonomy. Now, it's going to be really important for us to respond to those and to think, well, what is a Christian, what is a biblical response? But it might be helpful for me to give you a bit of a brief history before we focus on some of the details. Now, one of the important things to be aware of is that in England, this is not a new debate. Now, there's been a long-standing discussion about these issues going back around 150 years. So it was in 1870 that the term euthanasia was first coined. And with the development of medical anaesthetics, it was argued that this could be used to induce a painless death in the case of hopeless and painful illness, and then some argued in the case of mental deficiency. In 1935, the Voluntary Euthanasia Legalization Society was formed. You'll know that they've changed their name now to Dignity in Dying, which does sound a lot better. That was established in England. And at the time, many other countries were also talking about these issues. It was in Switzerland that assisted suicide was first legalized in 1942. The first time euthanasia was legalized was in Germany under the Nazis. They established a program called the Charitable Foundation for Curative and Institutional Care. Now, that is a classic case of euphemism if you ever wanted to hear one. The Charitable Foundation for Curative and Institutional Care. In the Nuremberg war trials of 1946, it was estimated that 275,000 people were killed by euthanasia under the Nazis. Now, unsurprisingly, that would seem to be a major reason why discussions about euthanasia stopped for a generation. But then, in the 1970s, this topic was then debated again in Netherlands, and by the 1980s, the Dutch were the first post-war nation to effectively legalize it. The argument was for medically induced, voluntary euthanasia in the case of unacceptable or unbearable suffering. And since then, about 2% of all deaths in the Netherlands have come under this category. And what we've seen in the Netherlands is that since the introduction of the law, there has been a broadening of boundaries, a relaxation of safeguards. So the criterion of unbearable suffering has then been applied very, very, very broadly. For example, people with dementia or psychiatric disorders or depression, or even children, can now qualify for euthanasia in the Netherlands. I was reading just recently about one of the doctors who is involved in bringing the law into being is now a fierce critic of it because what he's seen is so far from its original intention. Of course, euthanasia has also become legal in other countries too. The American state of Oregon, it was legalized in 1997 for capable adults with less than 6 months to live, but interestingly with no requirement that there be any suffering. And again, what we've seen is a huge expansion of the categories. Common reasons given by those seeking euthanasia in Oregon are loss of autonomy, loss of joy, and loss of dignity. Now, this has included people with treatable conditions like arthritis, anorexia, and children. 40% of those who die in Oregon under this law do so because they don't want to be a burden on friends, family, or caregivers. Of course, we've seen the laws change in many other countries too: Belgium, Luxembourg, Canada, Spain, Colombia, New Zealand, and parts of Australia. In 2022 in Canada, 13,000 people were killed under the medical assistance in dying law. It's about 4% of all the deaths in that country. And so time and again, what we're seeing is that once the law is changed, the safeguards are weakened, the eligibility criteria expanded. And it's important to note that this isn't surprising at all, because what's called the slippery slope is not just an empirical observation. It's not just this has happened to be and we notice. It's actually a logical necessity. It will always happen. And the reason is because if you legalize euthanasia or assisted suicide on the basis of autonomy, then to limit it is an act of discrimination. That is the argument that is given, and it's a sound argument. So here's what the Dignitas founder Ludwig Manelli said: if you accept the idea of personal autonomy, you can't make conditions that only terminally ill people should have this right. And so those who argue for euthanasia or assisted suicide on a restricted basis know full well that once the door is opened, it's only going to go in one direction. So the charity My Death, My Decision are seeking assisted suicide for non-terminal illnesses like multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, and motor neuron disease. They described the assisted dying bill as a bittersweet bill. Sweet because it opens the door, bitter because the door is not opened enough. Very likely, if the law is passed, it will be just as it has been with abortion. A law change for hard cases becomes a law on demand. Because what happens is that when the law changes, the culture changes. And so although people may argue for this being about me and my life, the reality is it's not about me and my life. It's about us and our lives and the kind of society that we want to be. We may think of ourselves as individuals in vacuums, but the reality is not the case at all. We are interconnected. Our choices affect other people's choices. So there's a bit of a brief history. What is a Christian or a biblical response? Well, let me take these arguments in turn. First, let me respond to the argument from compassion. It's really important that we start by saying, although as Christians we want to argue against assisted suicide and euthanasia, we never want to downplay the reality of suffering that people endure. We don't want to be blasé about it and dispassionate about the fact that these are real people with real fears. I remember personally seeing my mother-in-law suffer terrible loss in the last years of her life. She suffered a stroke, which brought on dementia, and then was effectively unconscious and bedridden. And it was just a heart-wrenching experience, seeing 7 years of loss. And it's understandable that there is a lot of fear, a lot of pain, and a lot of loss. We want to be real about the fact that we live in a sad world with much suffering and much distress. And it's not surprising that people are terrified of losing everything and seeing things only get worse and worse and worse. But we want to say that although compassion is the right disposition, it does not, it's in and of itself, guide us to the right way of thinking. That is, feeling sorry for somebody does not suddenly mean that encouraging them to take their lives is the right thing to do. We are not the first generation that has felt pity for people, and in the past that has not equated encouraging suicide. So I was reading a couple of months ago about an incident involving the celebrity singer Jon Bon Jovi. I won't ask you if you're a fan. He was filming a shoot in Nashville on the John Siegenthaler Bridge, however you're supposed to pronounce that. And he saw this man standing on the edge of the bridge, poised to jump. And Jon Bon Jovi, along with other people, did not go over and say, well, let me help you push you over, if that's really what you want to do. No, of course not. His response, with others too, was to say, no, let me help you bring you back to safety. Let me help you relieve your suffering, not bring an end to your life. Because instinctively, that is the compassionate thing to do. That is what we've always thought as a culture about suicide. And that is true compassion. And that's what we need to see. All of us need to recognize that. The police chief involved in that incident commented, it takes all of us to help keep each other safe. It doesn't work to say, well, that person's life is distinct from mine. No, we all need to help keep all of us safe. Now, no doubt, someone considering suicide is in deep pain. It may feel unbearable, but it does not follow that it is the compassionate thing to support them in their thinking. There is a difference between killing the pain and killing the person. And true compassion wants to help kill the pain, but not kill the person. And you see, here is the problem, the big problem with the argument from compassion. If you say it is compassionate to kill the person with terminal illness, then why do you stop there? What about the person with interminable illness? Isn't that worse? Isn't it worse to suffer for years than 6 months? And why would you stop with adults? And why would you stop with the mentally competent? And why would you stop with physical suffering? You see, if it's true, if compassion means killing the sufferer, then this law is not nearly compassionate enough. The truth is, if it is true, there are many, many more people to kill, if compassion really means killing the sufferer. But if we're Christians, then we must see the Bible never allows us to say anything other than that suicide is wrong and that human life is precious. And we need to be crystal clear on that. The Bible never portrays suicide as anything other than negative. We are not at liberty to destroy innocent life, whether it be our lives or the lives of other people. We are never at liberty to look at someone else and say, your life is not worth living. It is better if you're not around. We are not at liberty to do that. That is to break the 6th commandment, you shall not murder. Or Leviticus 19:16, do not do anything that endangers your neighbour's life. And so the argument from compassion doesn't work. It's not compassionate to take life. What about the argument from autonomy? I think it's important to see that this argument really is a philosophical argument that relies on a certain anthropology. Anthropology is the study of human beings. And what this argument does is assume that we as human beings are best understood as autonomous creatures. And therefore, the greatest good for autonomous creatures is whatever allows the greatest autonomy. But this argument, even in its own terms, doesn't really work, because we all put limits on human autonomy. Now, there are certain things that we as a culture say you cannot do to your body because it's damaging. That's why our government prohibits certain drugs, because we say even if somebody wants to use them, we won't let them use them because it's not good. So all because someone wants the freedom to take their lives, it doesn't follow that they ought to be able to do that, because autonomy is not absolute. And here's the question: what if we owe it to each other to protect each other from what we want rather than giving each other what we want? But at a deeper philosophical level, the Bible teaches a very different anthropology. Now, although freedom for an individual is clearly a good thing, an important thing, it is never an ultimate thing. There is something greater to human experience and human flourishing than simply freedom. And the danger is that freedom becomes an idol which only actually dehumanizes us and works against who we really are. So the Bible teaches that we're not fundamentally autonomous beings, but relational creatures. Creatures are made by God with inbuilt limitations, designed to be dependent, made to be loved and to love. Now, what is it that distinguishes us from everything else that God has made? Well, the Christian answer is that we have been made in the image of God. Genesis 1:27. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. And to be made in God's image tells us that we are uniquely valuable, and it also tells us that we are uniquely relational, because we image the God who is triune. And so if you want to understand what it means to be human, you need to see that we are, as with God, made to be beings in community. That is, we're fundamentally relational. We've been made to love and be loved, to depend and be depended on. Imagine the child going to bed at night, anxious and worried and wanting some assurance from their mum or dad. And they say, this takes a bit of imagination, "Mummy, Daddy, who really am I?" And most children aren't that philosophical, but imagine they were. Who really am I? How would a parent begin to answer that question? They might attempt to answer it scientifically and say, well, you are DNA, atoms, cells, bones, etc. But they're not likely to do that. They might go along the freedom line. You're an autonomous creature, my son. You are free to do what you want. No parent would ever say that. No, what they're going to say is, you are my child and I love you. Because that is at heart what it means to be a human being. It is to be loved and to love. We understand ourselves fundamentally as relational beings. And this social, dependent nature has been written into our life story. Think about your personal story. You did not choose the most important things about you. When you were born, to whom you were born, where you were born. You may lament all those things, but you certainly didn't choose them. We did not choose how we look, what sex we are, what our nationality, ethnicity, personality, and of course we didn't even choose our names. And so to say that we are fundamentally autonomous beings is to live in something of a make-believe unreality. It is simply not true. And it's profoundly not true. And yes, we grow up from childhood to adulthood and we grow to greater levels of independence. It doesn't stop the reality that we are fundamentally dependent beings. And in the arc of life, well, as we were born and so we die, utterly dependent, depending on others for our basic needs. And in one sense, that is just a humbling reality, isn't it? But in another sense, it is actually good and it is human, because We are made to be beings in community. People hate the idea of being a burden. But actually, that's what it means to be human. It is to carry each other's burdens and to be carried by each other, because that is what it means to love and to be loved. And so the Apostle Paul says, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. So I remember seeing my mother-in-law caring for her mother on her deathbed, and it was a beautiful experience, actually, a daughter tenderly caring for the one who had nursed her, and a remarkable reversal of roles. And then, as I said, a number of years later, seeing her, my mother-in-law, being cared for on her deathbed, the one who cared was now being cared for. And in a sense, that's very tragic. A death is a great enemy. But in another sense, there is something good about that. And this is something that really only Christianity can explain. And it's something our culture desperately needs to hear and understand. The greatest good is not to be free, to have everything we want, to be in control. The greatest good is to love and be loved. When you think about it, the argument from autonomy is a cold, dark, ruthless argument. It fails on its own terms. It misses the mark of what it means to be a human being, and it robs us of being loved and loving. At the end of our lives, what matters is not asserting our independence, but embracing the love of other people. This leads us to the argument for life that the fashion designer Joseph Conrad said this: "It seems extraordinary to me that as a nation, we operate on a moral double standard. If our pets are hopelessly ill, we have them put down to save them and call that humane. If, however, our nearest and dearest are terminally ill and writhing in agony that drugs cannot help anymore, we allow the law to insist that we do nothing." So there we have it. If we put down our pets, why not our parents? But when you think about that, the answer to that is actually really, really obvious, because a human is not the same thing as an animal. And we know that. And so what's really at stake here is the fundamental idea of the sanctity of life. The Bible tells us that every single human life matters. Every single human life is precious, regardless of qualification, distinction, regardless of our health, physical or mental functionality. See, here is the terrible thing that is being said in this law. Certain lives are not worth living. The dignified individual is the one whose body and mind works well. Think about that. That is brutal. If that is actually true, what it means is that many, many, many people's lives are not worth living. It undermines the dignity of many, many people. To quote Kathleen Stock again, the legalization of euthanasia does nothing to increase dignity, but provides a new way to undermine it. And so the problem with assisted suicide is that it lies about people. It says to people, your life is not worth living. You are better off dead. And that is a terrible thing to say to someone else. Now, if this law gets passed, we as a society are going to start lying to each other. And the lie that we'll start telling each other is, your life is not worth living. And that is a terrible thing to say to someone else. Whereas what the Bible teaches us is that every human life is valuable. It is good that you are alive. It is good that you are here. God made you and he loves you. And we are called to love other people and to affirm them and to be thankful for them and to appreciate them. In 1993, the House of Lords Select Committee on Medical Ethics explored these issues of assisted suicide and euthanasia, and they rejected it because of the wider societal impact. This is what they said: the prohibition unintentional killing is the cornerstone of law and of social relationships. It protects each one of us impartially, embodying the belief that we are all equal. And so really that's what this law is about. This is what is at stake: human equality, human dignity, and human worth. And if we want to uphold the value of life, we're going to want to oppose this practice. Now, we want to think this evening, and this is why Mark is here, about what it looks like to actually love people who are suffering. But before we get to that, I just want to cover one more issue, which is thinking a bit more about some of the dangers of this law. So, to begin with, social dangers. In the BBC documentary, Better Off Dead, Liz Carr, the disability activist, explains her fear of what this law will mean for disabled people. And the fear that she has is that every disabled person suddenly becomes a reasonable recipient of assisted suicide simply by virtue of being disabled. And so the implication this law has is endangering the disabled. She would say that such a person, in many people's minds, would now qualify for assisted suicide. I don't know if you've seen the documentary, it's worth seeing. But she talks about how people say to her, if I were in your situation, I'm not sure I'd want to live. And that is just a frightening thing to say to another human being. And what we've seen with abortion is that as a society, the disabled life is seen as not worth living. And if we say it's not kind to bring into the world someone with Down syndrome, if that's really true, well, it's also not kind to keep them in the world if that life is deemed to be not worth living, if we've said they're better off dead. So once you start thinking like that, and you have the legal capacity to act on it, that just puts huge pressure on disabled people who now have to justify their existence. That is a terrible thing to say to disabled people. It also has implication for the dying, and with this I'm also thinking about the elderly. A huge danger with this law is that it privileges the few people who want to take their lives, but in doing so pressurizes the majority who don't. If the law is legalized, doubtless many people will feel a certain pressure to die, because assisted suicide now becomes a valid option on the table, a medical option offered to people amongst others. And many people will want to say, well, I don't want to be a burden, and maybe I should consider this. And so suddenly the right to die becomes the duty to die. You might think that's a fairly cynical way of thinking about it, but actually, I don't think it is. In a very sobering article last year, earlier this year, the journalist Matthew Parris argued that it is indeed true that if we legalize assisted suicide, many people will feel that they're a burden. And he says they ought to feel this way because they're right to feel this way, because they are a burden. He says as the practice spreads, social and cultural pressure will grow on the terminally ill to hasten their own deaths so as not to be a burden on others or themselves. I believe this indeed will come to pass, and I would welcome it. He points out that we live in a world with limited resources, in a society with huge economic problems, an ageing population, a growth in people suffering with dementia. And so he argues that those who get to the end of their lives should think about everyone else and call it a day for the sake of everyone else. That is a terrifying argument. In a similar vein, here's how Baroness Mary Warnock put it in her book Easeful Death. If you're demented, you're wasting people's lives, your family's lives, and you're wasting the resources of the NHS. Now, most people are not so candid as to put it like that, but surely it is an inevitability that pressure will be put on the dying and the elderly and the vulnerable. And we have to ask ourselves, is that how we want to treat the elderly? Is that how we want to treat the vulnerable? This also has implications for doctors. if this law is brought in, it will change the very nature of what it means to be a doctor. Now, going back to the Hippocratic Oath, the doctor has been seen as the curer. This is the oath: I will use the treatment to help the sick according to my ability and judgment, but I'll never use it to injure them or wrong them. And so we instinctively think of the doctor's role as being there to promote health and life, and it's assumed that this very profession, with the idea of assisted suicide, the assumption is that this profession, the profession of a doctor, that which is about bringing life, should be the profession used to administer death. And so all of a sudden the doctor becomes the killer. And yes, there may be an opt-out system. I don't know how it would work, but in theory, this becomes the domain of many, many, many medics. And think about those doctors. Suddenly they have to experience the potentially traumatic reality of assisting in patients dying and helping them when it doesn't work, again and again, doing what up until now was seen as criminal as part of a normal practice. That is a huge burden on the medical profession. There are also implications for society. At the very heart of a healthy society is the concept of trust. Trust between leaders and subjects, trust between parents and children, trust between one generation and another. And the danger is with this law, what happens is there's a serious breakdown of trust. Now suddenly the older generation find themselves in a position where the younger generation don't want them around anymore. Suddenly members of families realize that their children would prefer to have their money and their resources and not them. After all, the mortgage needs to be paid. The cost of elderly care is astronomical. The inheritance would be useful. Suddenly, patients may be offered assisted suicide by their doctors and wonder what the motives are. See, the fear is that this law actually gnaws away at the very fabric of society. A number of social dangers. And then finally, there are some significant spiritual dangers too. In the world of the Bible, although death is the great enemy, there are actually many good things that come from it. Psalm 90:12 says this: teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. So according to the Bible, the wise life is one that sees that our lives are short, that we are passing, here today, gone tomorrow. And yet we know that our culture is a culture where people assume or live as if they're going to live forever and never think about death. The journalist Janice Turner has called our society a death-avoidant society because we do all we can to never think about it. In working age, people are too busy with work and family and leisure to think about death. In retirement, people are too busy with work and family, or not work, leisure and family and hobbies to ever think about death. Yet the book of Ecclesiastes says it is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting. Better to go to a funeral than a wedding, because we ought to think about death. And death has the potential to teach us how to live well, if only we would let it. If you go to a funeral, it makes you think, if you would listen, what actually is important in life? What do I want people to say about me? What ought I to live for? Am I ready to die? Am I ready to meet God? Because I can't escape the fact that one day this will be me. And here's one of the tragic things about assisted suicide, is that it will stop people having the chance to think about reality, having the chance to think about God, having the chance to wonder whether they are ready to stand before him. Because we know that in reality there is a wonderful answer to death, a glorious answer. Now, the problem is that after death we face judgment. In the end, no one escapes God. And yet in the gospel, through the death of Christ for sinners and his resurrection, there is a wonderful hope, the hope of forgiveness, the hope of relationship, the hope of a future. And that is what our culture needs to hear. There are more important things than this life, and the things to come are more important. And although there is a judgment in Christ, there is hope. And the fear is that this law will only further harden people in their unwillingness to face up to reality. So hopefully, that has given you a number of things to think about as to why we should resist and oppose this law and be against this practice. But as I said, a major question is, if we're going to say no to assisted suicide, well, what then for those who are struggling at the end of life? Which brings us to the topic of palliative care. But before I invite Mark up for us to sing, I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes to digest what we have just heard. So a couple of minutes to reflect on what struck you, any particular reflections. Over to you. Perhaps you could start by telling us a bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so for those of you that don't know me, I'm Mark. I am, believe it or not, a consultant. I'm a palliative care consultant and I work at Southampton General. So I'm full-time at the hospital and I work as part of the palliative care team within the hospital, and then on my on-calls, which I'm on call at the moment, I cover the community and the hospice. So that is what I do.
Is that your excuse for leaving the talk earlier?
No, I needed to leave.
Now, you just heard me talking about this issue, an issue which you know a lot about. I'd love to hear any particular reflections, things that you'd like to comment or add to.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things I'd add is the thing that riled me up in a sense the most was when this debate started, when Kim Ledbetter brought this. If you read her article in The Guardian, which I believe was the basis of her arguments within the House of Commons, she said for somebody dying in this country there are three options. One, that you die in agony and probably alone. Two, that you go to Switzerland. Three, that you take matters into your own hands, so you commit suicide. Those are the three options. Okay? Bear in mind, that is what is framing the debate at the moment, is information, sadly, like that. Okay? She got a strongly worded letter from me around, actually, there is a fourth option, and this is where I come in, and I'll talk about that a bit later on. The second thing I'd add is that we'll talk about it a little bit more in a moment, but the bill in this country is around autonomy. So it is around 6 months to live. Okay? So any argument that you hear based on pain, based on fear of pain even, based on compassion, shouldn't be actually on the table. Okay? Because that's not what the bill is around. The bill is around a prognosis of 6 months, which, as Pete said, has nothing to say about symptoms. Okay? So I could have 2 years to live, 5 years to live, and be in horrific pain. Doesn't count. Okay? And I know there's the slope argument, but actually any arguments you hear based on this, on pain, compassion, they're out the window. Because that's not what this bill is around. Okay? And actually, if you're not sad enough, if you spend enough time watching the House of Commons debate, which I did, every second, if not more than that argument, is, well, I've seen someone die in terrible pain. I've seen this, I've seen that. It doesn't matter. That's not what this bill is. Okay? So that's the second thing. So interestingly, the case of Daniel James that Pete mentioned, which is often the one that's put forward, he wouldn't be allowed to have assisted suicide or assisted dying in this bill because he didn't have 6 months to live. Okay, just something to think about. And then just going on right to the end, Pete talked about implications for people being kind of pressurised, I think is the right word, around cost of care versus cost of assisted suicide. This is actually a thing. There's an article that's come out from Canada, which is medical assistant in dying made, and there was somebody who went to their GP who was told, well, this is the cost of social care for you, or this is the cost of MAID. And they left that consultation absolutely horrified that they were basically told or pushed, you should accept MAID because the cost to society will be so great. Okay? So these are not abstract things. These are things that we have seen. And I think although the slippery slope argument is real, I don't even think we need to go there to argue against it, if that makes sense. Sorry, that was a slightly long-winded answer to that question.
That's really helpful, thank you. Just so one question is, there's a lot hanging on the doctor with this proposed bill. So, for example, a doctor may be involved in determining whether there are 6 months left to live, possibly in determining whether there is coercion. In some countries, a doctor needs to determine whether a patient is experiencing unbearable pain. Just what do you make of that from a professional point of view?
So I'm fairly good at predicting how long someone's got left to live. It's part of what I do, and having those frank discussions with people. I can usually predict fairly well if someone has 6 days left to live. Okay? I'm not bad at that. 6 weeks, I'm pretty ropey. 6 months, almost impossible. Okay? You can say, based on a population, so cancer care will say, we give you 6 to 9 months to live. All that is based on is this is what the population of people with your cancer have experienced. That's it. You take someone with frailty, can't predict for them. So my grandpa, who's 93, living with dementia in the care home, has looked like he's been dying maybe 4 or 5 times in the last 6 months. Any one of those he could have died, but he hasn't. I've predicted that he might be dying at least twice. And this is what I do for a living. And I've got it wrong. And so to predict 6 months, almost impossible with certainty. Okay? There are big things out at the minute around, so there's something called fast track funding, which is somebody deemed to have a prognosis of less than 12 weeks or 3 months. You can apply to the government to fund your care. That's great. The problem is the government are coming back to us and saying, well, we've got so many people who are still on this fast track funding 6 months down the line. And you're like, okay, therein highlights the difficulty in predicting. I saw somebody the other day who was told that he had 6 months to live 12 years ago. And he was still going fairly strong. Okay, he has now died, but it's really, really difficult. It's almost impossible at that time frame to predict. And then equally, if you flip that on its head and say, well, okay, we're going to ignore the prognosis thing because that's too hard, which, as I've already said, that's not what the law in this country is going for. We're going to go on unbearable suffering. Okay? If I inflict exactly the same injury on all of you in this room, you will all feel it very, very differently. Okay? So one person's unbearable suffering is not the same as somebody else's. Okay, that's allowed. But who's to say what is unbearable? You have to go based on what the patient says to you. Okay, that's the basis of pain management. Pain is what the patient says it is. The difficulty is that if someone thinks they're suffering unbearably because of a mental health condition, because of mental incapacity, so things like dementia, is that all right? Are we just going to go there and say, fine, okay, you think you're suffering intolerably, that's fine, we'll end your life. I think that's not a pleasant way to go. Plus, a lot of what I do is managing people who think they're suffering intolerably. Okay? However, I would ask you, how many patients do I see who fulfill Kim Ledbetter's criteria? Number 1, you're probably going to die in agony and alone. how many people, let's say in the last week, do you think I've looked after that have died in agony and alone? None. Okay? How many people in the last year do you think I've looked after that have died like that? One. Okay, and I can think of them. Okay, and they were not alone, they were in agony. Okay? So it does happen, but it is not the option. You either have that or you die. Okay? So I think we just need to think about that, and I think it is going to put massive untold pressure on doctors. Interestingly, I don't think it will put the biggest pressure on palliative care doctors. I think it'll be GPs that bear the brunt of it, because they're the ones that see people every day. They're the ones that see people, the largest number of people and the largest amount of suffering, I would say, would be general practitioners. I think it will hit them harder than it will hit us. I think that answers your question.
Thank you. So we've been talking about you as a palliative care doctor. Some people struggle. Some of us are struggling to pronounce that word. Some of us know what it's about. Some of us have no idea. Tell us about what it means to be a palliative care doctor. What's your experience with it? Why is it a better option than assisted suicide?
So, to palliate just means to cloak. Okay, so that is essentially what I do. Okay, I'm a big cloak. Okay, I don't wear a big black cape. I don't carry a scythe. I'm not the death doctor. Okay, a lot of people think when they see us walking on the ward, this is it. This is curtains. I'm done. Okay, I think maybe one stage removed from the vicar walking on the ward, but never mind. So to palliate is to cloak, and what I do therefore is I'm a specialist in symptom control. Okay? And a proportion of what I do is looking after people at the end of life. Okay? Now, the reason that I use those words, and I pick my words really carefully when I talk about palliative care, is partly because things have changed. So in the last 30 years, so palliative care has only really been a specialty for 40 or 50 years. Palliative care has really moved. So we used to be end-of-life care, cancer. That's what we did. As we've realised that we're really good at symptom control, we're moving all to other conditions. So we'll look after anyone. We're also realising that people don't have symptoms only when they're dying, so we look after anyone. We look after anyone with symptoms. Okay, that's quite a lot of people. Okay, and we are supporting them from a physical point of view, from a psychological point of view, from a spiritual point of view, and from a social point of view. So there's this idea of holistic care that you'll hear bandied around, okay? And that's all it is, it's seeing a patient as a whole, okay? So my patient is not just ovarian cancer. They are a patient with ovarian cancer who lives within their social construct, and I seek to manage and know all of that about a patient, okay? So I manage symptoms and I look after people who are dying. Linked in with that is also care of the families that come with those patients as well. So we do a lot of that too. Does that answer what palliative care is? Why is this a better option? I mean, I think you can look at this from two aspects. And if we think about the kind of compassion side of things first, that's almost the easier thing, isn't it? Because actually, oh wait, I'm a specialist in controlling symptoms. If you're looking on the compassion side of things, you're saying this person's horrifically symptomatic, which is usually always pain. That's always the one that all the articles go for. I can manage that. Okay? I'm pretty good at managing that. Okay? And I'm blowing my own trumpet there. I am quite good at managing pain. I can do that. I can manage other symptoms that people have. Okay? And I can do that so that somebody does not die writhing. So what was the quote near the end that Pete talked about? Our nearest and dearest are terminally ill and writhing in agony that drugs cannot help anymore. Okay? That is a quote that could do with being 30 years ago, 50 years ago, when there were not drugs that could manage symptoms. That is not the case now. Okay? I have a list of armaments as long as my arm. Okay? I may have short sleeves on, but there's quite a lot hidden up there. And I can manage people's symptoms. Okay? And we can do that. Almost the harder thing is then looking at the autonomy side of things. And this, I think, is where the actual big argument driving all of this debate is coming from. Okay? So, as I said before, try if you can to slightly filter out all those arguments based on symptoms, because they're not what the bill is about. Okay? Also, bear in mind, as an aside, if you look at most of the cases they put forward, most of them are 10 years old, at least. And that's just the way of it. These cases don't come along very often. Okay? So actually, most of the cases that Dignity and Dying have are old. Okay? Things have moved on. The difficulty is that when you look at the argument from autonomy, you would say, actually, yeah, I mean, why wouldn't you go with it? If you take God out of the picture, are we surprised that actually this is what our society is wanting to do? Now, I know that's maybe slightly depressing, but that is the culture we live in. That we live in a culture that has removed God from the equation. Therefore, if you remove God from the equation, I am in control of what I do to myself. Okay? So it is slightly harder to argue against that. Okay? But I think we can. And I think we can based on Christian values, but actually probably more important, not based on Christian values. Okay? Now I'll explain what I mean by that. If I stand up and I say that the assisted dying bill is wrong, and it's wrong because, and then I spout lots of things that are exactly true and exactly biblical, the problem is the vast majority of people listening will say, well, I don't believe that. Okay? So you have to look at it from almost a non-biblical point of view. And actually, I think there are big arguments around societal impacts on the way that we die, impacts on how we die, impacts on what that leaves behind. So Cicely Saunders originally said, the memory of, I forget the exact quote, but the memory of those that die continues in those that live. Okay? And actually, this is not a pleasant way of dying. Whatever anyone paints for you, this is not pleasant. Okay? This is not nice. This is not sanitized. This is horrific. Okay? And again, I know that sounds brutal, but that is the case. Okay? If I'm honest, I would much rather die with my symptom control versus an assisted dying or a euthanasia situation. So I think we have to look and argue from an almost a non-Christian point of view against that. And I think there are enough arguments, as Pete has gone through, that actually say you are important because you're you, because you're a human, and actually we have a societal responsibility to care for people. And I think we see that, don't we? As Pete mentioned, suicide prevention. It's massive. Why are we paying so much on stopping people killing themselves, if then we're going to say, well, it's all right to kill yourself a bit later on, why don't we just leave them all? And again, I know that sounds brutal, but we spend so much time and effort and money on stopping people doing that. Fine. If we're then going to say, well, actually, it's all right, you can go down this legal route to do it. And I think we need to look at it from those angles and remember where this is going. That was a really convoluted answer to your question, I think.
It's really helpful. One of the things that I've heard quite a lot is how ironic it is that we are a culture in a place with the best palliative care, and yet this is the time that people are pushing for assisted suicide, and just how strange that is, that those things coincide.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. John Wyatt, if you listen to any of his talks, and I know Pete's mentioned a couple of his books on the back, and he spoke at Christchurch a few years ago now, and actually he said he spoke to a lord who was having dinner with another lord, and on occasion they were chatting about assisted dying, and the one lord asked the other lord, why is this not a thing in England? Why? And the first lord said 2 words: Cicely Saunders. Okay? Now, Cicely Saunders set up palliative care, the hospice movement in this country. And actually, because palliative care has been so strong, it's why it's taken this long to come. So I think it is interesting that at one minute we're told we have the best palliative care in the world, which I think we do. But actually, it's also why it's taken this long, in a sense, to get to this point, I think, because we have options. What I will say is the other thing that I think is interesting, and I wrote to my MP around, is that you don't have to look very hard to realise, I think you in Salisbury are slightly fortunate, virtually all hospices are charitably funded. I think Salisbury's not. I think they actually sit as part of the hospital, but they don't. Fine. So a third of palliative care funding comes from the NHS. 1/3. 2/3 is from charitable sectors. Okay, that is the value that we're putting on people's dying. Okay. Yet, if you look at this bill, if it passes, it'll be funded entirely centrally. And I think that, again, is a horrific mismatch. And people more impressive and important than me have made that point already, but it was another point that I made again.
It's really helpful, Mark. In a moment we'll open the floor for questions. Then we're going to pray. What can we be praying as Christians for the moment?
So the first thing I would ask all of you to do before you, as you pray at the same time before you pray, is to write to your MP. Okay? Write to them, let them know that you're against this. Because actually, MPs, if they go to debate this, are going to debate it based on what their constituents think. Because I guarantee that those MPs do not have first-hand experience, virtually all of them. And so they are going to have to debate based on what they think and based on what their constituents tell them. And in a sense, that's the right thing to do. So we, therefore, as constituents, have a duty, in a sense, to tell our MPs what we think. So please do, write to them. Okay? The other things that we can pray for is pray for Christian witness in the House of Commons. There are Christian MPs. They are few and far between, but they are there. Pray that they'd be bold and that they would stand up against this. Also, pray for those that are not decided. Well, pray for those that are decided, again, to vote in favour of it, that they change their mind, but pray for those that are undecided as well. Okay, that they would see the truth of the arguments. And equally, I think we just need to pray for God's will to be done. I think we live in a society that has turned its back on God, and it turns its back on God every day. And there is biblical precedent that says God will hand them over to their desires. And I think we need to recognise that as well, seeing this happening. So pray that actually, as a nation, we turn back to God. I think that has to be our biggest prayer. That's probably what we're praying every day anyway, for the people of Salisbury and beyond. But actually, that's what we need, because if we turn back to God, then we turn away from this. So I think pray for that. And then pray for us, maybe on the front line, that we would stand up as not death doctors, but people who deal with death all the time, and actually speak out and be bold in standing up against this.
That's really helpful. If you didn't get it, the debate is on November the 29th. My understanding is that they'll be voting on that day, which is remarkable because there's no time to think about it. Last time it was 330 to 118. There were probably more sympathetic people in Parliament at that time to oppose it, or to a more Christian way of understanding. But we need to pray for a miracle, don't we? The Lord is sovereign. Whatever happens, which is helpful, we want to pray that, and we're going to come to this in Habakkuk, in wrath, God would remember mercy. And there were people last time who went into that debate planning to vote for it and voted against it because of the clarity and the passion with which people argued. Are there going to be people doing that this time? I don't know, but let's pray for that. We want to pray for a miracle. We're going to pray soon, but I'm just going to open up if anyone has any questions. Probably for Mark, I'm here too, if that's helpful. You've heard a fair bit. Any questions?
Oh, I was just going to ask what life with your colleagues like, competition maybe. Do you talk about it much? Are they
So interestingly, if you go back to the last time this was debated, the BMA, which is the British Medical Association, did a poll. And they did a poll of the general population of doctors and of palliative care doctors. Well, they broke it down. They said at that point, 60% of the population were in favour. Then you went to doctors, 60% of doctors are against. And then you went to palliative care doctors, and 80% are against. So I think it's interesting that actually as you see the, I'm going to call it death literacy, increase, you see people against it. And I think that holds sway. So within my department at the hospital, there are 5 consultants. I'm the only Christian consultant out of them, and all 5 of us are opposed. Okay? One of those is very, very outspoken. So her name, if you happen to see it, is Carol Davis. If you follow anything on Twitter or any of these other social media platforms that I don't understand, or indeed in the press, if you read things, you may well see her name. And she is non-Christian, and she is fully opposed, and she is the most outspoken of any of our team. So within the hospital, we're united. We're united against, and I think that probably holds for most palliative care physicians. Yeah.
Quick question. First one, did I hear you correctly? You were saying that the assisted dying is the painful way that's horrific. Do you want to? Can you elaborate why it seems a powerful argument is I've never heard?
Yeah.
And secondly, what do you make, what do you understand by Wes Streeting's comments about he who voted against it because he doesn't think palliative care is sufficiently good in order to make a fair comparison for everyone?
So, I'll take that first one first. So, I can't remember which, it may well have been Terry Pratchett a few years ago, did a documentary where he followed somebody to Dignitas, and actually they showed them. If I may be a little bit graphic for a minute, the way that they terminate life is by giving a big dose of barbiturates. Okay? The problem is that barbiturates, if you take enough of them, make you horrifically sick. They make you gag, they make you vomit. And so they have to give you shed loads of anti-sicknesses, antiemetics before that, and then they give you the barbiturates. So anyone who actually says this is a pleasant, serene, nice situation is actually lying. They've not seen it. Also, it is not the kind of this fairy tale picture of being in your own room with nice people around you. It's really sanitized. Okay, it's really, really medicalized, and I don't think it's pleasant. I think that would be my understanding. That would be the first answer. The second, I think that Wes Streeting is right. I think it is really interesting that Wes Streeting has come out the way that he has. He obviously being the Department of Health, and actually to come out and say that palliative care is not funded enough to make a comparison is correct. You can't say, well, we should bring this law in if you're not going to fund palliative care fully. So you have to fund palliative care 100%, and then let's see the results before you then talk about this. So there was a study done a while ago now which showed that this so-called desire to hasten death, as it was called in the paper, which is around the desire to end your life, actually with 6 weeks of palliative care input, you could reduce that by at least 50%. Okay? Based on those that didn't receive and those that did receive palliative care. And that's in 6 weeks. Okay? That's not very long to reduce that desire to hasten death. And actually, therefore, if you're not providing palliative care, good holistic care to everyone, then you cannot say that we need to bring this law in. So actually, I think that is an interesting thing that he's come out and said. I think he's right. And I think it is one of the big arguments that, again, if you watch the debates within the kind of behind closed doors that they did writing the big report, they had the head of palliative care in the UK, the head of Sue Ryder Hospices, and the head of another charity to do with palliative care, and this is from the arguments they made, was that actually you cannot do this because you have to fund palliative care properly before you can compare and say that this is okay. What I do think is interesting on that point, sorry, I'm going to digress a minute, is that look at the countries that have this as law. Do they have the best palliative care in the world? No. We do. Okay? And actually that's based on big international surveys that they've done. And I wonder, that chicken and egg, we don't have assisted dying yet because we have good palliative care, but equally you can go the other way around and actually say that we have good palliative care because we don't have that. And those countries that do have assisted dying, there isn't the need to fund that. So I think you can look at this, but I think it is. I'm greatly thankful for Wes Streeting's comments.
Thank you. Any other questions?
You touched on the need potentially to make kind of non-Christian arguments, because obviously people aren't Christian, they're not going to accept it. I think correct me if I understood, but I think you said you don't have to make kind of argument from what's kind of best for society as a whole, and kind of make societal argument. Is there any way to kind of argue for the kind of innate value of human life? You know, I suppose it was in a secular
So I think that point is interesting, and building on something that Pete said, is that if you take God out of the equation, the end result is that we're not worth anything. Okay? That is the way it goes. And if you look at that, so Peter Singer has taken that to its extent, Dawkins has taken that to the extent they have, and actually, theirs are the logical arguments. If there is no God, we're not worth anything. So actually, why do we care about all this stuff? Why do we care about anyone else? I mean, I don't. Why should I care about anyone other than me? Because I'm the most important person. I'm the only person that I should care about. And the difficulty is that a lot of people want to have both bits. They will say there's no God or whatever, but they won't go to the full extent that they should do, which is that no one's important. And so it is hard to argue on the innate value of personhood without God. Because actually it's God that gives us our innate personhood. Okay? It's God who made us, and therefore we are valuable because we're made in his image. The difficulty is that most people don't want to accept the other alternative. Okay? So it is harder, but I think you can base on the innate value of people, and actually looking at so a lot of people will often look at, so for example, the lady who made the documentary, the disabled lady, she is actually I think you call them actors these days, she's an actress on Silent Witness. She has a really fulfilling, really full, really happy life. And actually lots of people have said to her, as Pete said, if I were in your situation, I don't think I could do that. And she's like, do what? I have a really good life. So as soon as you take God out of the picture, you say, actually, I'm only as important as I think I am. And if I've had enough, so be it. So I think you can argue on a kind of full societal, because actually there are great evidence of people who are profoundly disabled, for example, or ill, adding to society and actually giving us loads of important stuff. So you can argue on that. I think also, if you argued it, you can argue it based on relational. So actually, I care for my mum and dad, but in reality I shouldn't really, because they're just the place I came from, and they're not important. I'm what's important, but actually I do, and most people in society would say they do, or they care for their children, or they care for their friends. And actually I've had interesting debates where I've asked people why. Why do you care for them? And they're like, well, because they're important. I'm like, why? And if you go back far enough, you have to have the answer, because they're made in God's image. But society likes to work on that relational and societal basis. Does that answer your question?
I think that's a really helpful question and answer, and I think this is where this is potentially a really good opportunity for us all to try and talk to people about these things, because we as Christians have a way of explaining reality that no one else does. Most people don't want to talk to you about the atonement or the resurrection, but actually this issue and ethical issues are issues that people will likely want to talk about, and this isn't going to go away after the end of November. And I think the point is there is no coherent basis for the dignity of human beings outside of God's word. And what you said, Mark, is absolutely right. People want to hold on to two contradictory things. They want to say, there is no God, we're here from time, chance and matter, and yet we really matter. And we believe in human rights. And it's interesting, isn't it, that in the last 10 years or so, we've only seen a growth in people wanting to affirm the importance of human rights with absolutely no logical basis whatsoever. And that is a really, really strong Christian argument where we can say to people, hold on a minute, that makes no sense. And there are high-profile cases of intellectuals who are seeing, maybe we need Christianity after all, which isn't enough for, that doesn't mean they're becoming Christians necessarily, but there are, I think, some for that reason. But I think we want to say, look, why is it that human life matters? So we're not. Is that a Christian argument? Well, we are appealing to what people believe intuitively, and saying, well, what's your explanation for why you think we matter? And this is a wonderful, and we need to pray, don't we, that this could be increasingly a wonderful opportunity for us to be able to say, look, don't you realise that without God, this doesn't make any sense? And this is one of the compelling reasons for taking the Bible seriously, is that it has explanatory power in a way that nothing else does. Okay, we'll stop there and we're going to spend some time praying. Let me suggest we spend 10 minutes in groups praying. We've covered a number of things. Thank you, Mark, for things we could pray. Hopefully that is enough for you. And I'll come and close us in about 10 minutes.